Thanks, Ed. And welcome everyone to this penultimate session of the Connecting Small Histories History Festival, which has been such a rich delight, and I'm really glad so many people could join us. This session is Cyber Heritage, Jewish History in Social Space, and we're really lucky to have 4 people's voices with 3 people speaking, if you follow me today. First, we'll have Toni Griffiths speaking on behalf of Beral Westlake on connecting small histories through social media and archives. And then we'll move on to Mike Beral and Sue Temple, who will be doing a 2-hander on Lily's legacy. So I'm going to start just by giving you a few house rules. As Ed has said, everybody has already been muted. If you have questions when we come to the question Q&A, which we'll do after both papers, do write them into the chat. However, if you also would like to ask them, we're a small enough group, I think, we may not be by then, but because we're now up at 21. But I think we're probably a small enough group that if you'd like to speak your question out, just put your hand up and I'll call on you and ask you to unmute. I expect that all of you are aware that it's important when you're in a social space like this to be polite and respectful, and that we may well be talking about issues that are sensitive, so be sensitive to each other. So without further ado at this point, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Toni and indeed Bella. Toni is project officer for Connecting Small Histories, and she's also an honorary fellow at Swansea University. She has experience of working on other lottery-funded community projects and also has a background in Jewish history and heritage. She's presenting the research of one of the project volunteers for the Connecting Small Histories project. Bella Westlake is a student archivist at UCL, and she was inspired to join the Connecting Histories team because she has a particular interest in the histories of communities which aren't formally recorded, and she likes to bring those histories to light. So I'll ask Toni to begin the paper on Bella's behalf.
Thank you very much, Sarah. I will just share my screen, so please bear with. It's hiding the tab that I need, of course. There we are. Okay. Thank you, Sarah, for the introduction. Good evening, everyone. Unfortunately, as you know, Bella is unable to be with us this week, but it's a great pleasure to be able to give this short talk, to give some insight into the great research that she's been doing as a volunteer for the Connecting Small Histories project. As Sarah mentioned, Bella was inspired to join the Connecting Histories team as she is interested in the histories of communities which are not formally recorded and bringing those histories to light. In the first instance, then, Bella began her research on the Jewish community of Bradford, and from here it took on a new direction. Indeed, the story of Bradford's community has been well researched, it seems, for example, by prominent local historian Nigel Grizzard. So having read up about the history of Bradford's Jewish communities, Bella started to consider this aspect of history from a different perspective, looking instead at how it's been remembered and preserved via history groups on Facebook in an online or virtual community. So let us start with a brief overview of the Bradford Jewish community. Dating from the early 19th century, the community began with an influx of German Jews attracted by the textile industry in the city. They built businesses and helped to cement the city as a commercial hub and contributed to an increased quality of life in Bradford for many generations to come. The warehouse district there is still called Little Germany today. The community continued to grow, but it wasn't until 1873, when it numbered between 200 and 300 individuals, that the town saw its first elements of organised Jewish religion with the formation of the Jewish Association. By this point, the town also had its first foreign-born Jewish mayor and would go on to have 4 Jewish mayors in total. In the late 19th century, the Jewish community was joined by newcomers escaping from Tsarist Russia persecution. At first, Russian Jews joined the Reform synagogue in Bowland Street, but quickly moved on to form their own Orthodox synagogue in the Manningham area. The First World War was a turning point for the community of Jews in Bradford. Strong anti-Jewish feeling damaged the community to some extent. Many changed their names or moved away from Bradford. However, the Bradford Jewry continued to grow, and in the first decades of the century, there arose a new merchant class, including individuals such as Oswald Stroud, the son of Rabbi Strauss, and the Jerome family. During the Second World War, and in the decades after, the Jewish community in Bradford grew further from an influx of refugees from the continent. However, as elsewhere, from the 80s, many Jewish families and young Jewish people left Bradford for Leeds and London, and both the Orthodox and Reform communities decreased in size. The city's Orthodox synagogue on Springhurst Road in Shipley closed its doors in 2012. The Reform synagogue on Bowland Street is still open, although it was almost forced to close in 2013 due to the high cost of roof repairs. Closure was prevented when Bradford's Muslim community raised funds to cover the costs. A £103,000 lottery grant soon followed, enabling full repairs to take place. The number of Jewish worshippers, however, has remained low, but the new interfaith relationship between Bradford's Jewish and Muslim communities has blossomed, and interesting historic links between the two have been found. For example, Zolfil Karim, secretary of Bradford Council of Mosques, learned that the mill where his father worked after emigrating from Pakistan in the 1960s was run by a Jewish descendant of Joseph Strauss, the rabbi who founded the Bowland Street Synagogue in 1880. These photographs were published in The Guardian in 2019. They were taken by Nudrat Afzar, who has been documenting the dwindling population of Bradford's last remaining synagogue. Nudrat is part of the non-Jewish community who sometimes attend services at the Reform synagogue, which are now held monthly. She herself is Muslim. Indeed, the synagogue now operates an all are welcome policy, although certain activities, of course, are restricted. 95-year-old chairman of the synagogue, Rudy Lever, states, "They can sing along and so forth, but they can't take part actively. For example, when we carry the Torah around the synagogue, they can't do that. And they can't read prayers from the altar. But we welcome anyone to come and join us." The last census, which took place in 2011, found that there were just 299 Jews left in Bradford, a markedly low number in comparison to the growing Muslim community, which stood at 129,041. Now we're in the process of completing another census. I wonder what the latest results will show. Bella's research began looking at the history of Bradford's Jewish community and moved on to look at how it's been represented on Facebook history groups. Here we can see the group Old Photos of Bradford. The image on the left shows a photo shared from the Bradford Jewish website. Victor White outside his tailor's shop, it reads, "White Brothers on Hope Street off Manchester Road, Bradford." On the right is a photo, possibly, it says, from 1967. It shows the synagogue in Bowland Street, partway through stone cleaning. As the soot is removed, it says, "The beautiful stone from the 1880s is revealed." I think that the difference between these two sections of the building is something quite special, and I can't help but look at it for really long periods of time. Here we can see another image of the Bowland Street Synagogue and also some comments where the author is sharing a link to the Bradford Synagogue webpage. Bella notes that overall, the prevailing reaction to Jewish history within these Facebook groups is one of surprise at how far Jewish history intertwines with Bradford's own and interest upon its discovery in the first place. Quotes that she's recorded include, "I didn't realise there were so many Jews in Bradford. I thought they were all in East Leeds. It's German Jews in the 1800s that built Bradford. It's all in its history and I've read it on Google. You will see the Star of David in the windows and stonework in the bookshop. I believe it was financed by wealthy Jews. I learned this on a visit to the wonderful Bradford Synagogue." The surprise of the members at learning that Bradford has a significant Jewish history is not particularly shocking, but the members' openness to learning is a widespread and encouraging sign. Here are two images from the Memories of Bradford Facebook group. The image on the left shows two German Jews of Bradford. The gentleman on the left is Jacob Behrens, 1806 to 1889, as a young man in 1884. The other is unnamed. The text reads, "These are the forefathers who made Bradford into one of the richest cities in the world, the driving force behind export of wool. Manningham was the heart of the Jewish population of Bradford." On the right are several images of Victorian Bradford, including a Jewish street peddler. Thus, the groups provide a wonderful tool for education. A photo of a Hanukkah party elicited the question, "What party? I've never heard of Hanukkah before," and a swift reply followed from the post authors to explain. In public history groups such as this, members come from a range of backgrounds and are able to learn about the place they call home. Bella says that positive stories, like the fact that the Bradford Council of Moss donated towards the repair costs of Bradford Synagogue, as before mentioned, can be shared and brought to light here, along with other stories and memories that might otherwise have been forgotten. However, there is also a dark side to these groups. For example, in a post about a Jewish wool merchant, one commenter writes, "I think that the immigrants in the late 19th century were completely different. They and others put into this country, whereas most of them just take, take, take." It's an unfortunate sentiment found in these groups. Anything good about the past is compared to the present, and the present is found lacking. Indeed, much of this negativity is directed at the large Asian community, and whilst group moderators can and do delete such comments and ban the commenters, some unfortunately remain. Away from the larger public groups exist smaller community-centred groups which are mainly private. These require questions and authorization before becoming members. Although the number of Jews living in Bradford now is very small, social media allows the community to stay in touch with one another in these groups that are private. All of these groups allow sharing and interaction between people who no longer live close by to one another. One commenter notes, "The history of Bradford shows how important it is to have an open mind. Interaction with and immigration from other countries played a significant role in the history and development of this place." In conclusion, Bella writes that public Facebook groups are ostensibly an informative place for communities to share memories and photos of their heritage. People will add an interesting photo or a status which encourages others to comment and react. These comments in turn are generally positive. They mostly exude warmth and nostalgia in a team game of who remembers when or who remembers what. But as the demographics of a community change, this nostalgia can quickly turn sour. Photos of shops and buildings which have adapted to meet the needs of a new immigrant population can provoke racism and xenophobia, and this is often exemplified in posts on these groups. Posts describing the antics of the old community characters can often end in complaints that they just don't make them like they used to. The city of Bradford, just outside Leeds in West Yorkshire, is home to a large number of people of Pakistani heritage who bear the brunt of racism in these Bradford history groups. But many of the posters, commenters, and sharers seem unaware of the city's diverse history and the invaluable contributions these immigrants brought to the area. Bella concludes by saying nostalgia for the past can blind us to the fact that communities, especially urban ones, have changed and will continue to change in incredible ways. There never was a perfect then and imperfect now, but only the waxing and waning of groups with their own perfectly imperfect stories.
Thank you so much, Toni. That was really lovely and really great to get a sense of the complexity of what's going on in those groups. And we can have an appreciation. I see some people have gone for the virtual applause already. What I'm going to suggest is that we will move directly on to the second paper, and then we'll take the Q&A for both papers together to allow for the discussion to develop a bit more organically. So I'm going to move on to introduce Sue and Mike now, and they are going to be speaking to us on the topic Lily's Legacy, Voices and Visions of Liberal Judaism, the Making of an Online Exhibition During Lockdown. Mike has been a member of the Liberal Synagogue of Elstree for over 30 years, having grown up at the Liberal Jewish Synagogue of St. John's Wood and having been a member of the Blackpool Reformed Jewish congregation for a couple of years in the late 1970s. Mike's worked with Lily's Legacy project, contributing his video skills and also as a member of its steering committee. Sue has been involved as a volunteer in the Lily's Legacy project since the start, having been initially intrigued by the idea of collecting oral histories from people at all points along their liberal Judaism journey. So welcome, Mike and Sue, and I'll hand over to you.
Sorry, I forgot to unmute. Thank you very much for the intro, and we're both delighted to be able to share the story about developing the Lily's Legacy project. The way to introduce it really is to put it in some kind of historical context, because who on earth was Lily Montagu, and where did it all begin? The beginnings of Jewish reform actually had begun in Germany almost a century before Lily was born, but it was a letter which she had written in 1899 to the Jewish Quarterly Review, which is said to have been the trigger which really altered the path of Anglo Jewry. Now, in this letter, Lily spoke about her concerns regarding apathy that she had identified among congregants. She was a very devout and sincere, serious Jewish woman. Very young, she was only early 20s when all this was going on, the turn of the century, and she was the one who identified that people were beginning to fall away. She identified an apathy which she was very worried about and felt a strong need to address this. She wanted to inspire spiritual awareness that she felt herself and to make services more relevant to the times. Her religious beliefs really were based on the Bible, and she regarded the Bible as the way to live. It was a guide to life, and she was aware that the old traditional forms of Jewish worship, the traditional coming from Europe, etc., needed a shift in order to be able to re-engage with people, especially the younger generations coming up. Lily had felt that by confining worship to ritual observance of the traditional synagogue service, etc., was to miss a crucial opportunity. She was able to acknowledge it as early as 1910, really, the increasingly secular life led by many Jews of the time, because we always think people then would have been much more observant, but it would seem not the case. And she wanted to give people a new framework which accepted that, but which was still based on key tenets of traditional Judaism and the ancient faith, which she absolutely loved. And she wrote in this letter, I'll just read you one quote. "If we are sufficiently for Judaism to desire its continued existence, we must reformulate our creed and express more clearly the claims it justifiably may make upon our actions and our lives. So here's this young woman, 25 at the time she wrote the letter, but also, as I say, a woman. And on both those cases, very, very unusual for the time. It's safe to say that at the turn of the century, pretty much all communal activity would have been run exclusively by men. As well as being, as I say, a very spiritual person with this incredible ability to have identified what was required to bring Judaism to a modern congregation, she was also exceptionally well organized. So she had this dual skill set, really, and she was able to galvanize others into action too. In 1902, Lily established the Jewish Religious Union, which was actually an association of Orthodox, Reform and Liberal Jews. Nothing much changes, you might say, committed to the revitalization of Anglo-Jewry's religious life. And she's still sticking to her love of the traditional spiritual ideals. Many people were concerned that this new movement coming through would create a schism in Judaism. But by 1909, the union had actually been fully established, and the first congregation was founded a few years later in 1911 at the Liberal Jewish Synagogue. It was originally in Marylebone and then later moved to St. John's Wood. You'll often hear Lily Montagu referred to as one of the three M's, and this is a reference to the crucially important contributions made by her counterparts, Claude Montefiore, the first president of the union, and Rabbi Israel Muttock, who was rabbi of the new liberal Jewish synagogue. So those three were formidable. But fundamentally, it was Lily, as founder and eventual leader of both the Jewish Religious Union and, interestingly, the World Union for Progressive Judaism, which still runs, who truly organized the establishment and development of liberal Judaism. So coming back now to our project, and I'd like to emphasize our project's called Lily's Legacy, but really it's not just about Lily. It's about the issues that she identified, that she clarified, the change that she sought, and the changes that she was then able to implement against all the odds. And the legacy, really, we think, is that liberal Judaism today continues to respond and adapt. So I think we're going to come into, now we're going to talk a little bit about why oral history and why now.
Thanks, Sue. So, yes, I'll pick up from there. And I want to pick up that point that you've mentioned. The project, it's a brilliant marketing title, Lily's Legacy. But it really is about the legacy that Lily has left us, and if you like, what we've done with it. So the original aim, well, when I came on board fairly early in the project 2 years ago, I found my own way of describing it to people who maybe didn't quite understand what we were aiming for. And I said, if you like, what we're doing is we are filling the time capsule, the perception of what liberal Judaism is about today, so that in 50 years' time, people who are researching social history can go back and into that time capsule and say, oh, so that's what liberal Judaism was thinking about in 2020. So whereas quite a lot of this festival has been about researching the history, in a sense, what we're trying to do with the Lily's Legacy project is document where we are now for future historians. Inevitably, and almost because of its title and the way that Sue described it, a part of it also proved to be further documentation of the life and times of Lily Montagu herself, and particularly where we were able to talk to older people who may have had direct contact with Lily. We were able to capture all sorts of different anecdotes, which maybe don't make their way as much into the history books, but into just people's lives. So the project started off as a classic oral history project. with National Lottery heritage funding to try to capture at least 40 full oral histories following the usual disciplines and practices of those oral histories. And Sue will talk a little bit more about that in a minute. Because it was Heritage Fund supported, the aim was very strongly and equally to encourage the use of volunteers. And although there is a full-time project manager, Sian Kanan, who unfortunately can't be with us this evening, there are a number of volunteers played larger and smaller parts in the project, including Sue and myself. The aim is to formally deposit the findings of the project with, amongst others, the London Metropolitan Archive. The Jewish Museum are interested in taking some parts of it, one or two other partner institutions. But we'll talk a little bit later in this presentation about how we've delivered the immediate findings, if you like, for consumption now, as well as just filling the time capsule and making it available to those archive institutions. So, Sue, would you like to talk a little bit about oral histories and how that worked?
Yes, I was really intrigued by the idea of being involved in a project which would allow me to learn how to take an oral history. And it's very, very different to any other kind of interview. So the idea of oral histories, it's like, as Mike said, it's capturing, it's making that time capsule. It's not the normal traditional kind of history that, and you'll never ever find these kind of snippets, that these golden nuggets of information in any history of liberal Judaism. Oral histories are, I'll run through briefly how the training went. We were given volunteers came together. None of us knew each other before. We met Sian, he introduced the project. Obviously, we had an interest in it to have triggered our attendance at the day to begin with. But then we were taught by a prof from Newcastle who was teaching on oral histories how to actually go about it. We came up with what we called our interview guide, which was a series of triggers that we wanted people to cover certain subject areas as we went through. And don't forget, we're looking at a century of liberal Judaism, really, the history that's covering from Lily to the present day. It's a century and it's big. So we had to make sure that our interviewees covered all the age groups as well. So we spent an awful lot of time trying to come up with the pathways that would cover people's lives. It was absolutely fascinating. So it was things like faith, family, community, history of their own families. A lot of people had come through huge trouble to liberal Judaism and found it a great place of comfort after a journey through other kinds of Judaism, that was all very interesting. So it's gathering together diverse voices that wouldn't normally be heard at all and giving them the opportunity to be shared. It was absolutely fascinating. So we came up with about 11 different themes, and then the clever part was just choosing people. You sit in front of somebody, and at that stage we hadn't gone into lockdown yet. So the first half of it was real interviews face to face. So it was absolutely wonderful, and people love to talk about their lives. They absolutely love it. It was such a privilege to be part of it. After the fourth day of training, we were ready to go, and the first few were quite daunting, really, because you feel, why would somebody want to give you their secrets? But people loved it. People absolutely loved it. And then we also included memorabilia. So did they have photographs? Some people came on kinder transport. Some people had converted to liberal Judaism from another faith. Some people had changed to liberal Judaism from the United Synagogue or similar. And every single story was fascinating. And part of the training was the technology training. That wasn't such fun for me. And when you've done an interview, the interview may have taken an hour or two, then you had to transcribe it. And we started off doing it literally word for word, because there's very strict rules about what you may or may not do. You're not allowed to change anything. If the dog barks, and you have to write down dog barking. But along came Mike. He's my saviour, because he introduced us to some software that did all that for us after a while. So he's definitely my saviour forever now. I can't tell you the number of hours that saved. So then there were a lot of people. Not everybody stayed on the project, I have to say. It didn't, obviously, as with all volunteer projects, some people find it's not for them. But there were a core of us who were very keen, and it was absolutely lovely. And what we found was that people value the things about liberal Judaism which Lily identified all those years ago, that we need to change, that we need to reflect what's going on in the world today. People are very politically aware, and they needed to have a religious life that reflected that as well. So there's so much more to say, but we'll come back to the interview guide. Over to you, Mike.
So the project started with this ambition of the formal oral histories. I learned about the project once it was already underway, and I have a background in a relationship with liberal Judaism, but I wasn't so interested in that level of formality. But I'm a keen videographer. And so I approached the project team and said, is there a role for capturing some of these stories using video? And they said, well, what do you mean? And what do you envisage? And so on. And I said, well, maybe there are some smaller anecdotes. Maybe capture them amongst the communities rather than on one-to-ones. But maybe it'll work on video and it'll just give a different dimension. And the team were keen to explore this. And that's then exactly what we did. But so rather than talking about it, let me just quickly play you a clip. I'll play 2 or 3 clips during this presentation, just to give you a feeling of both the content and how we were achieving it. So this first clip is Rabbi Margaret Jacoby, who is the rabbi at Birmingham Progressive Synagogue. Birmingham is a mid-sized synagogue, but we're ticking, if you like, 2 of the 3 boxes from Lily's perspective. And this is a female rabbi talking. And the clip is a little bit under 2 minutes. It'll give you a flavour of, if you like, the softer side of all of the information that we were capturing throughout the project. Here's Margaret.
Particularly, I've always enjoyed studying the Talmud, because not only is it a fascinating intellectual problem working out a page of Talmud, but it has so much to say about what justice is. And
I'm sorry, I'm not sure why Margaret froze. Let me try her again and see if she's going to play the whole of her clip for me. Let's try again.
particularly, I've always enjoyed studying the Talmud, because not only is it a fascinating intellectual problem working out a page of Talmud, but it has so much to say about what justice is and working out what's fair, which has also been something that I've thought about a lot. And I've recently become a magistrate, seeing that sort of question put into practice. And I think at the back of my mind, I've always had the thought that Lillian Montague was a magistrate as well, one of the first female magistrates. And what's inspired me most has been her call, just the indivisible nature of social justice and Judaism, that what you did in the world beyond working for fairness, she worked as a factory inspector and a social worker and all sorts of things. And that was just inseparable from what Judaism was. Judaism was about prayer and about services, about bringing people in, but also looking out, reaching out to the world and making it the sort of place you thought it should be. And I think it's fair to say that one of my joys in the congregation is that so many people do seem to share those values as well, so that we've been able to do things together. We're part of Citizens UK, which looks at local issues in Birmingham like poverty, refugees, low wages, and we have a tea for refugees once a month as well. And it's that sense that we're here to be a community, but also to reach beyond, that I think we share within this congregation.
So I don't know about you, but I think just having someone chatting just brings a whole new dimension to the sense of history and the sense of social history, and a perception of the way that, in that case, Rabbi Margaret is talking. Exactly 12 months ago, of course, the project had to change. Lockdown hit us. And at that point, we thought we had captured most of the material that we'd intended to capture, but word was getting out that we'd been capturing material, and despite the fact we'd been asking for 9 months for contributions, of course, as soon as we closed the door, the rest of the liberal Judaism community came round and said, no, I must say my piece. So at that stage, of course, we switched to using Zoom, and yeah, Zoom works, and it's not exactly the same, but here's a little piece that we captured on Zoom, and we've just edited it a little bit just to make it maybe more accessible. This is from a small community. This is from the Wessex community. They're talking, again, after one of their Shabbat morning services, but they're sharing some of the life and times of Wessex. So here's Wessex.
As a community and as in a sort of multi-faith context, I've always tried to be on interfaith work, and Adrian's just whispered in my ear, don't forget the refugee house. So several members of Wessex Liberal Jewish community were involved, but also people from local churches, somebody from a local mosque, and quite a lot of people. There was some Quakers who were great, actually, and everybody put in some money in about 2 years ago now, 3 years maybe, 3 years now, and we bought a little house in Bournemouth, and we paired up with a refugee organisation who brought a family over, and they're now living happily in Bournemouth.
So, would you like to take us on the next part of this journey?
I would love to take you on the next part of this journey. I think that it's interesting to understand that the part that oral histories make. Recording, preserving and interpreting information based on personal experience is very different. And because we've been looking at this specific period of time, this 1 century, it includes actual eyewitness evidence and all these precious stories passed down over the years by word of mouth. It was absolutely invaluable way of preserving this knowledge and understanding the lives of older people in liberal Judaism who, as I said earlier, actually knew Lily Montagu, and were so proud to have had that, to pass on that memory. She was very keen that girls who didn't have any kind of wealthy family behind them often had to work on a Saturday. This is just one example. And they had to help keep families fed. The young women had to work on Saturdays. So she arranged for services to be held at other times, just so that these young women wouldn't feel disenfranchised from their Judaism. She was really a social worker as well, and that has come through the beliefs and the understanding of being a liberal Jew today. It hasn't changed at all. So if you're looking at a conventional history book, you really can't use very many anecdotes, but oral history is anecdotes. That's what it is, and that's what makes it so rich and so interesting. And you know, people say what they like, and some of it was quite personal, and some of it was quite, you had to be careful, because a lot of mention of rabbis in these oral histories. People are very influenced, and rabbis play a huge part, important part in people's lives. And that came through over and over again. And also, I was just thinking about the paper that we heard at the beginning around Bradford, that taking all these different histories from different people in Britain, you'd find little nuggets that were connected. It was like weaving a tapestry. Oh, I did an oral history with so-and-so, so-and-so in Manchester last week, and now I'm hearing about the exact same thing from somebody in Brighton. And that was unexpected and wonderful. So it's got that dynamism about it, that immediacy, and that reading text in an ordinary account would never give you. And once Mike started making the videos, it all came to life. It's like an immersive experience, really. These backgrounds are all filled in with all the lovely anecdotes, and we had photographs, we had bits that were Jewish synagogue annual reports that had reference to people. It's just, it was extraordinary how it all unfolded. Interestingly, we had a couple of people who realised halfway through that they didn't want to give their real name, you know, because of maybe the job that they did or the place where they lived. They were happy to give us their full story, but not happy to be identified as that person. So we worked out, there is a way in the oral history tradition of using pseudonyms as well. The legal stuff around taking oral histories is quite serious, and we had to learn the do's and don'ts. That was a really important part of it, and Sean was very good at doing all that. We found that people were very proud that they belonged to a religion which was able to say, well, we've been here, we were the first to have LGBT, we were the first to have mixed faith marriages and same-sex marriages and all of those things. And that really felt as though Lily had come through, I would say. That was really important to people. The ultimate legacy is that there's this archive collection. It's going to be left with London Metropolitan University, which is one of our partners in this project. And it's the legacy is the living proof that liberal Judaism is thriving and growing and changing and adapting now in exactly the same way as Lily would have wished it to be. Back to you, Mike. Okay.
So really just to finish off, I want to say just a few words about how we delivered the material. We've talked about delivering it to the archives, but we also wanted to stage an exhibition for current consumers. Originally, of course, that was envisaged as a physical exhibition. Liberal Judaism hosts a biennial conference, and obviously every 2 years, and the intention was to deliver to that, but clearly that didn't happen. So it turned into a virtual exhibition, and I think for the best. So there is a separate website, lilieslegacyproject.com. I'll pop that in the chat in a minute. Where there are extracts and clips across 10 or 11 different themes, and you can explore it through audio, through video, through photographs, by theme, and so on. And it's had a very positive response. I mentioned the audio as well, because it's one thing capturing all of these oral histories, many of which will be an hour and a half. But what we also did, and maybe that's where I'll leave you, is created some podcasts. We created 10 roughly 20-minute podcasts, again, without trying to attribute each of the speakers, but really, again, just to tell the story. So here is just one extract of one of those podcasts, and maybe it takes us full circle because this includes some of the memories of Lily Montagu.
I know she was highly respected in our family. My father used to talk about, oh, well, Lily Montagu came round to our house. She very much wanted to make Judaism relevant to Jews in England. I mean, you know, like they used to sing All Things Bright and Beautiful at Shawl and things like that.
Well, she was a large lady to start with. Without wishing to be unpleasant, very much a spinster. I never ever thought of her in terms of any romantic connections. She may well have had them, but if she did, it was news to us. And she and her sister, Marion, who were very close, they were always together, were formidable. They were big people. And we were little people. And they'd achieved so much, and especially in terms of the clubs that they'd run, or she in particular had run. Later, we met the product of people who'd been in her girls' clubs and boys' clubs.
So we'll leave it there. Hope you found it interesting. And yeah, Sue and I, of course, be happy to try to answer any questions which have come through the chat.
Thank you so much. And again, let's do the virtual clapping and I want to thank all of the speakers for really fantastic papers. Obviously, it's going to be more difficult for Toni to answer any questions, but I hope that there'll be some discussion that might ensue from the paper that she delivered on Bella's behalf. But maybe we will start with the questions that have come through in the chat for Mike and Sue. And the first set are on Lily herself. And Trish Skinner asks, did Lily have any resources behind her to help her? Did she have a position of relative privilege to give her the platform to speak out? And I think Hillary's question that goes alongside with that is, what's her background? How did she earn a living? So those two questions maybe come together. So could we start with those?
As I said, she was actually a social worker, although I don't think in the terms that we would identify a social worker now. But yes, she did come from a privileged background. She had a very good education. She was obviously very bright academically, and she'd been lucky enough to have a good education and a father who allowed her as a daughter rather than a son to follow her passion. I think when she first started, she probably didn't have a great deal of backing, but as her ideas became more and more accepted, and people saw that she was onto something, then a lot of people were happy to get behind her. And as the clip that Mike played of that last interviewee, that was a typical response of my interviewees who'd actually met her. That came through all the time. She was formidable, she was unapproachable, she was stern, she was very, very serious. She was a devout religious woman who was determined that Judaism should be brought into the modern age. And luckily yes, her father did support her, and she did have an education to give her those tools to start with. Thank you for the question. I can't hear you now.
There we go. Sorry, I was muted again. We have another question following on from Trish here saying, did you find that interviewees' memories were mainly positive, omitting negative elements? So did they self-edit when they were giving you their oral histories?
I'll go first. Perhaps Mike will have a different view. Did they self-edit? I'd say people told the truth. if they told me things that they felt were a bit unsafe, if you like, then they might have been one of those people who went under a pseudonym. But most people told their story with all the worrying bit. Some of it wasn't all that flattering to certain people who, you know, are still alive, not just people who are deceased. They were very honest, and most of I'd say the people that came in for some flack would have been rabbis that they felt hadn't supported them. And then huge praise for the ones that had, because you know, that relationship between the family and the rabbi is absolutely fundamental. And yes, I think people were very honest, and they told their own stories, good and bad.
I think it was a little bit different when we were doing some of the video clips. Most of the videos were shot in groups of 8, 10, a dozen people, typically after a Shabbat morning service or some other event at the synagogue. And so people were talking in a slightly more public space, whereas on the oral histories, they were talking one-to-one.
Yeah.
And they were typically giving a 7, 8, 10-minute anecdote as opposed to a full story. And they were universally trying to be very positive. They were talking about the amazing things that liberal Judaism had done for their lives. And so in that sense, I think it's fair to say they were probably they were choosing the positive sides of the anecdotes to explain typically their journeys, how their life journey had gotten to where they were today.
That's really fascinating. That's a really, really interesting insight, that the different ways in which we work with people's stories make a difference, the kinds of stories that they tell. So when we talk about the richness of having oral histories and videos and photographs and having different ways of people being able to work with their stories, that sounds like it's really important. We also have a question from Hilary about whether there are provincial liberal communities that are involved in the project as well, or, you know, I guess, is it more in the larger cities? So.
Well, I'll pick that one up first. I mean, the answer is there are around about 35 liberal communities in the UK. And we reached out to all of them. And I think, if anything, we probably had more, well, no, I would say the input was pretty balanced. I mean, I personally visited our Suffolk community, which is very small. Interestingly, some of the smaller communities then subsequently joined on Zoom. So the clip you saw there was from Wessex again, which is a much smaller community. But equally, we captured some of the material at the annual day of celebration. It was held at the Liberal Jewish Synagogue, St. John's Wood, where over 300 people were there. So I would say it was very much across the piece. We were very keen to make sure that we captured the cross-section. In fact, early in the work, we identified a matrix of the typical characteristics, if you like, of the 40 or so oral histories that we wanted to capture, to make sure that we had people of different demographics in terms of age, geography, sex and sexuality, religious persuasion, whether they were born or had chosen Judaism, really to make sure that, if you like, we had that multi-dimensional matrix. Because whilst, as Sue said, oral history is, in some senses, informal, we still felt we had a responsibility to make sure we got as many different voices as we could capture.
Well, thank you. And I think it's interesting, that it does lead through to a question that I have, if I take the chair's prerogative, about the nature of the online exhibition. That you mentioned in the talk that in some ways, actually, the online exhibition you felt is almost a bonus. And you've already mentioned that, you know, we have these differences in responses of different kinds of technologies and ways of representing. So what do you think are the main benefits of having your exhibition online?
Well, I mean, I think two very obvious ones, and then Sue will put her observation. One is purely accessibility geographically. Traditionally, an exhibition like this would be a series of display boards that are schlepped around the country, provided to synagogues, put in their back hall for 2 weeks and nobody sees them. And the smaller communities who don't have premises don't get to see them at all. That doesn't work and it's not attractive. But secondly, where the majority of the media, of course, lend themselves to online rather than offline, because oral histories and video histories need to be seen and heard. And although, yes, we have transcribed all of the material, that's as much to make it academically searchable, because, of course, it's very difficult to search an audio file unless it is transcribed. But in terms of making it accessible, I mean that with a small a, then having it online, we hope and we know has made it just so much more visible to a much broader public. Sue, anything to add to that?
I absolutely agree with all of that. I mean, it feels now that it is an online exhibition, it feels like a no-brainer, because why would it, in 2021, even without the pandemic, why would it not be? It's got the facility to be updated easily. It can be fresh all the time. We can add voices and clips all the time. We can take it. It can go anywhere. I mean, this, as we're taking part in this festival now, and this is going to go worldwide if anybody wants to access it. So it's just wonderful. We wonder now how a physical exhibition would actually have worked out, because as Mike said, you know, they just gather dust in a corner somewhere and they're out of date before they've even got going. So we're grateful. This is a really good outcome. It's much better to have it online.
That's fantastic. Now, we still have about 15 minutes of time left in our session. I noticed that Trish has a comment about Bella's paper in the chat. And I wonder, Trish, would you unmute and maybe just speak to it for a little bit?
Wrong one. I didn't mean to do the video, but never mind. Hey, yeah. So I was just thinking about Bella's timeline and thinking about the outbreak of anti-Jewish feeling during World War I. And of course, this morning in the festival, we heard about World War I in the round on another fantastic project. And it just explains why possibly Herman Bergson, whom we heard about this morning, marrying Margaret Topaz, who we've now heard about as well, in Bradford in 1915, gave his name to the civil registrar as Brown rather than Bergson. So therefore making himself a little more invisible to the historian trawling traditional records, and of course names are notoriously slippery, you know, sort of in terms of what people choose to call themselves and how they change their name. But Toni and I have found a bit more out about Margaret as well, but we might want to share that well, either this evening or tomorrow evening. But it was simply the fact that Herman quite consciously and strategically called himself Herman Brown when he stood up in front of the marriage registrar rather than Herman Bergson.
This is such an interesting thing, this idea about the way that people self-present and how that interacts with the way that we engage with them as historians. And I wondered about that in relation to the complexity of the record that is being created through these, being referred to as we had in this session, as cyber histories, right? That the perception that Sue's brought up of that of a textual history that's very focused on details and facts, and then we compare that with the kinds of histories that are unfolding here. That the glimpses of people are much richer, but they may also be very difficult to follow in that complexity. I think that Toni has some things she might like to come back on in that as the person that presented. So Toni, do you want to unmute?
Yeah, great, thank you. Yeah, just to elaborate a bit more on what Trish was saying and the importance of names, the importance of, like Mike was saying, sort of doing these video interviews, but also oral histories, and how the complex kind of arrangement of all these different types of interviews and interactions between Jewish heritage and history is really important, including events like this as well. As we've noticed over the course of several of the sessions, there's been these connections, which is quite funny given the name of the project. All of these connections have popped up along the way, and people have been almost reunited with lost friends and family that they, or acquaintances that they hadn't spoke to in a while, just from one end of the spectrum, but also through history as well. So as Trish mentioned, this Lady Margaret Topaz popped up on one of the slides as an example during the British First World War and the Jews project this morning. It was a fascinating paper, an amazing project, but suddenly we thought, oh, Topaz, hang on a second. One of the people involved with our Cumbria research and Sunderland connections as well was one Jeremy Topaz, who has rather kindly recorded his story, and it's up on the Heritage Hub as part of the History Festival at the moment. Anyway, so we contacted him just today and said, Margaret Topaz, is this any connection of yours? And he responded to say, yes, this is Auntie Maggie. And so we found this connection across projects, across volunteers, and across history. So she was one of his father's siblings, 7 sisters and 1 brother, and she had 3 children of her own. The last one, Esther, died unfortunately earlier this month, but aged a grand old age of 96. And 2 of her children, 2 of Esther's children, are Reform rabbis, one of which is Rabbi Walter Rothschild, who has attended many of our events and has commented and been a really active part of this history festival. So yeah, I just thought that was a good comment to tie all of these strands together and just show the impact of this sort of stuff in real time.
Thank you so much for putting that all together there, Toni. It really does demonstrate the importance of cyber histories in that sense. And both Ed and Hilary have comments in the chat there about the importance of name changing in Jewish history, both as a practice and also as a facet of the history. I wonder if either of you wanted to say anything more on that.
It's not something that came up for me in the interviews, but it's certainly part of the generation of the post-Second World War, post-First World War, Second World War Jewish generations. It's definitely part of their experience. It was normal, wasn't it, to change? I know so many people whose families changed their name. They were immigrants, not just in America, but here as well. But it didn't come up in the interviews.
I think that, there were a number of accidental changes of names, immigration, emigration through this country. My surname's Horwich, which is a small place outside of Bolton in Lancashire. But there are lots of Horwiches in America, which is, you would think it's not a very American name. And similarly, when you had the expulsion from Spain, you had a lot of families taking on new names, which were a bit more familiar to the places where they ended up. So if they ended up in what is now the Czech Republic, they would take on a more sort of Czech name. And if they ended up back in Syria or back in Iraq or Iran, Persia, they would tend to take on a name which was more familiar in those territories as well. And you find that sometimes, for instance, my grandfather, although his passport said Horwich, which was changed from Horwitz, when he got to America, he tended to use Horovitz because people knew Horowitz better than they knew Horwich. So that's the way names do change. We've got a couple of people who've got their hands up, Sarah. I wonder whether you want to pull
See that. Now that we've finished with yours, the next person we'll ask for is Howard, please.
Okay, I'll do this very quickly because I've got a few different things. One is that I've heard various sort of personal testimonies as sound files, and then seen different things in video. And video seems to be, whichever format it is, whether it's Zoom or something else, it seems to be so much more engaging when you look at it afterwards. So maybe people might comment about that. Certainly the university in Sheffield, where I am, I've done quite a few personal testimonies from elder members of the community, and that's all sound files, and it's much more difficult to listen to. A couple of quick other things. We're quite fortunate in one of the elder members of our family, somebody arranged for what was going to be a major birthday celebration to get a video company, a specialist company, to do a time capsule where they merged his interviews with video interviews of him with lots of personal photos and photos of places. Absolutely amazing record, especially since there were things we had never heard before, some things, which is quite interesting. And sadly, he died only a few weeks later, and it's been an amazing record. And then just one other minor thing, in that we've been dabbling in Sheffield, we've been dabbling with Zoom quite a bit on all sorts of things. And one of the things we tried doing, which is a sort of, if you might say, a light touch on interview, we've been doing what we call sort of desert island discs with a few elder members of the community, where we sort of talk to them about their earlier life, different stages of their life, and then pick up some music that they like. And people have found that absolutely fascinating in terms of finding out a bit more about members of the community, and also some of their stuff about music actually tells them quite a lot as well. So it's an interesting thing. If anybody's bored in their community with doing things on Zoom, then try doing that with a member of your community. Very interesting. Definitely not a full personal history, but it's still worthwhile doing.
Thank you so much. I know that we have Janet who wants to ask another question, but does anyone want to respond to any of that from Howard, any of those questions?
I'll quickly respond on the video versus audio, because I know that the formal oral history takers are somewhat concerned about whether video distorts the way people talk. That because they become self-conscious and aware of being seen as well, somehow the way they will talk tends to be a little bit different. So I think what we recognized, Howard and others, was video is, yes, much more engaging for dipping into and getting a feeling for. And I think we would still argue that oral history definitely has its place as a more formal discipline as opposed to a more presentational style. I think there's room for both.
Thank you so much. Janet, do you want to bring your question? Janet, do you want to unmute?
May I make a comment?
We may have lost her.
Yeah, no, I'm here. Sorry.
Sorry. Okay. Can we take Janet first, and then we'll move to you, Lawrence? Okay.
Yeah, I put in the chat my question about, well, my comment about when ancestors have their names changed when they come to this country, or they change them themselves. And I mean, I just hit a brick wall because I have no idea what one of my grandfather's names were before he came in the 19th century. But I've been doing editing some oral histories for the Wessex Jewish community, and it's fascinating. I mean, some people do know. I mean, one chap told me a story of how his ancestors arrived in London's East End, and they just picked the name from the shop that they happened to be standing outside, and they saw the name and they just took that, and then it's been anglicized for the next couple of generations. And so they're fascinating stories, but if you don't know what the original one was, it makes it very, very difficult to do research in the old countries from where they came.
Yes, I really appreciate that. Does anyone want to say anything about that, or can we move on to Lawrence's question? Let's move on then to Lawrence's question, just as we're coming on the end.
Thank you. I don't actually have a question. I sat down this evening and I found it a little astonishing because my lovely late mother was Lily Montagu's secretary during the Second World War. And she took dictation from her and told quite a number of lovely stories about Lily Montagu. I also found amongst my mother's papers club magazines from the early 1950s, 52. I've sent them off to Pam Fox, who's an archivist, and she is really extremely interested in them. And yeah, my mother was working for or with, as a volunteer, didn't get paid, obviously, with Lily Montagu.
Fascinating.
That's really is. It is fascinating. And as Toni said earlier, the way in which, no matter when you talk about this material, these more and more connections come up, more people are connected, and that's really been the focus of the whole Connecting Small Histories project. So it's really wonderful to see it happening. And Toni also mentions in the chat about the importance of music and how useful that has been and how rich that's been. We are coming just on the end of our session. If there's anything that anybody else wanted to say that was that would finish us up, that would be lovely. But if not, we can. Oh, we have a new chat message here. Let me just see it. Yes, again, Howard comes back again on this question about video and about how maybe our perception of what video is and how people respond to it changes over time. And I think that's really true. He says, you know, that a year ago, people might have been more nervous about having a video camera pointed at them. Now we're so used to it with Zoom and those kinds of things that maybe people's perception changes over time. And I think that's really is a good thing to finish up on, because it's about the ways in which different ways of capturing histories and people's memories and people's stories. There's not just one way to do it, and as time goes by, different kinds of ways of working are going to be giving us different kinds of results. And as long as we can make those connections, keep making those connections, then all of them produce a much richer resource for us. With that, really, I want to draw the session to a close. Thank you so much to our speakers and to all of you who've come along and shared your questions and thoughts. And I hope that you will turn up for tomorrow's grand finale at 6 p.m. Just to thank the speakers once again for excellent papers this evening.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, Sarah.
Yes, thanks, Sarah. Very, very interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Good night.
I hope to see you all tomorrow.
Yeah, you just need to delete the word ideas because we're expecting the food and the drink to be emailed to us.
Yes, we've made it in it's slot-like, so it goes through the letterbox.
Letterbox, yeah. Letterbox drinks are fine, yes. Yeah. A miniature of Gordon's, I'm sure it'll fit, it'll be fine, don't worry. Good. All right, thanks everybody, good night.
Thank you, good night.
Bye everyone.